All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with bite.
Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 362. Stronk Independent whammon. Now's accidental confession. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with the personification of perceptivity, Mike Stevenson, and the Doge in charge, Brian Martinez, who is working in the background, so you probably won't hear anything from him. We probably won't have a Lauren tonight. She's a little under the weather.
Just sleepy.
So
she's just very sleepy.
So she's sleeping.
She's got a proper job.
Yeah. Lauren works hard. But we have tonight the accidental confession of the toxic sisterhood of the National Organization for Women. They probably have no idea that people will recognize this based on what they have said in this rant disguised as I don't know what they call this, but it basically gives some information by the nature of their complaints that I don't really think they had intended people to take away from this whole set of complaints, which this is what women do best. All right, women complain better than women do anything else. And here you have, they have so many complaints on this list. It's unbelievable. And when I go through it periodically just to look for specific things, and I open some of the stuff that they've linked to, and one of the things that I noticed is they almost exclusively get all of their information from the New York Times, which is generally speaking an indication that someone is mentally ill. Like if they don't read anything but that, there's a high chance that they need medication. But in any case, and the other thing that I noticed is, far from its original reputation, and as a great news organization with hard-hitting stories and original work, the New York Times does an awful lot of reporting on things that other news organizations reported first, and then they just put their own spin on it. So back when I was an aspiring journalist and I was studying journalism, which was in high school, and I say aspiring, I was working for a newspaper at that time. We studied, the Washington Post and the New York Times and all these big newspapers and their histories and everything. We watched, I can't remember the movie that had Robert Redford in it, about Woodward and Bernstein, but it was, like we were told, these are the guys to admire and everything. And then I got older and figured out they missed the most important part of that story. And the most important part of that story was what Nixon was doing in the background and why they actually did that break-in. That's a story for another time. But the history of the New York Times during wartime and throughout its from its beginning, really, it was kind of lionized as this great publication. Yes, all of the President's Men. That was it, Jen Bottle. Thank you. But it just is shocking to see how blog-like they've become. Like, that's what bloggers do. Bloggers read news stories and then they write articles or essays, basically, with their own take on the news story, and they link usually to the original source. Sometimes article writers on a particular topic that several contributing news stories are involved in, like what's going on with Title IX. Well, here's a bunch of different news stories with a bunch of different information. I'm putting that information together, and this is the conclusion that I'm drawing, or the information that I'm providing. Here's the pattern, or whatever. And that gets done by maybe better bloggers, but it's not really news reporting to do that. It's just passing the same news story around like like a drunken hoe at a frat party. It's really sad.
We can try
But
to understand the New York Times effect on men. Something, 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 staying alive. That's actually a line
yeah,
from that song. It's when you read through the lyrics, it's the weirdest song ever. What is the New York
yeah.
Times effect on men? BGs. Can you expand? Never mind.
Well, their misandry is nothing new. You could go back through some of their older stories. You can find that out.
Would be prescient
But
as hell for the Bee Gees to have discovered this back in the 70s.
yeah,
Uh,
yep, that, and of course they've been manipulative in the past too. Like they come up when you study about great publications, but they also come up when you study about publications that engage in something called yellow journalism, which is essentially a combination of clickbaiting and, except of course before clicking existed, and political spin. So social political spin often. But so we've been going through this. We'll go back to the top of the page. They basically call it Trump administration is harming women with almost 100 policy mandates, threatens healthcare, economic security, and fails to protect women from violence. So that's the Trump administration's policies harming women. This is their list, and we've been going through this list. And remember, the last couple of weeks we went through the file of things that were discontinued, the hundreds of National Science Foundation grants for research that were discontinued as a result of funding cuts. And as it turns out, what we discovered was that actually Trump was just cutting the funds off from the long march through the institutions of feminist, the feminism's particular brand, their intersectional brand of cultural Marxism, and that's why Ho's mad. So today we're looking at some more reasons, and as I was going through this, right, I noticed a pattern. One part of the pattern was there's still a lot of intersectional feminist long march through the institutions things that they're pissed off about. John Doe says we're still funding Israel. Yeah, the feminists are still getting their money. And yes, I am calling Israel a feminist state. So just the crap that has been promoted with regard to feminism coming from that nation. It's
every
as much
state
a
in the Middle
feminist.
East, every
Yeah,
state in the Middle East is a feminist state. This,
yeah, pretty much.
this is grade 8 men's rights activism, folks. A lot of people have
Yep.
trouble with this, but yeah, same shit, different color. That's kind of all.
We hear all the time about those patriarchies over there, that patriarchy over there, and people frequently will cite a news article from like 2008 or so, something way back when. That then I think the National Organization for Women is the one that promoted it. In fact, so it might have been where the furor came from over that specific incident, because there are dozens of incidents like that have made the news that nobody ever talks about. But there was an incident where well, there were two actually. There was one where we were all told that a woman was executed for being raped, And I started digging through it. And actually, what I found out was they didn't execute her for being raped. They executed her for uh, engaging in adultery with an individual who was not involved in any rape. The issue basically had been during this extramarital affair with this individual, she had given him nude images of herself, and she got nervous about him having them, and she met with him to get them back so she could destroy them. And while they were meeting, which this was in a country where she was supposed to have an escort from a family member to leave her home, and she did not have an escort from a family member. While they were meeting, and it's a clandestine meeting, so they're in a location that she can get to without being seen, and he can get to without being seen. They're sitting in a car. Their car was attacked by a gang, and the gang beat the hell out of him and raped her. And she reported the rape. She had to, because they beat the hell out of her too. And in doing so, she had to admit that she was out without a family member, who she was with, what was going on, and it came out that she was having this extramarital affair with this man. And so they both got executed, because it is that nation has a death penalty for extramarital affairs. Right? If you they refer to it as fornication. If you engage in fornication, male or female, you got the death penalty. There was another instance where they said that a woman was caned or whipped, whatever it was, for being raped, and I looked into that one as well. And so what I found out was the evidence in their case pointed to a consensual affair. She was not married, so it was not a death penalty offense. She wasn't having an extramarital affair. She was engaging in premarital sex with this guy. And as a result of that, the penalty was this lashings, right? So this is, yeah, we're talking, if you weren't here when I started, we're talking about that patriarchy over there, right? So when I read the whole case, when I read the whole outcome, what I found out was he got 120 and she got 80. And I also found out that under their law, if she accused him of rape and he was found guilty, he would have had the death penalty and she would have gotten off scot-free, unless he agreed to marry her and she agreed to marry him. And if that was the case, then they wouldn't have been punished. So essentially, when a woman is in that situation and she fears punishment, she goes into the court and says, no, he raped me, but I'll marry him if he's willing to marry me, right? And then the guy is stuck in a position of either fighting the case or taking the other punishment of getting married to this woman who is so willing to quickly lie about him. And the evidence showed that they were in a consensual affair, and so they both got their punishment. But in a patriarchy that treats women as less important than men and oppresses women, why did she only get 2/3 of the punishment that he got? I always bring that up because some patriarchy.
Yeah, it's a similar thing that happens in areas that are considered stereotypically, hick or hillbilly. The phenomenon of the shotgun wedding.
Yep.
Yeah, it's not just in the Islamic world. It's all over the entire world. Whenever there's an extramarital or premarital affair, it's considered so undesirable that someone has to be charged with the crime. And it's always the man. It's always the man who's charged with the rape. And then we get these stories that a woman was murdered for being raped. And it's never that. I mean, it's almost never that. But even if it was murder for being raped, you have to wonder what certain feminists make of this. Certain feminists who think that rape is worse than murder. Because rape victims have to live with the consequences of what's happened to them. Because even losing their lives isn't as bad as living their lives knowing that they have been overpowered by a man. Because being overpowered by a man is worse than death. So with that logic in mind, you should murder people who've been raped, because then they don't have to live with what happened to them. This is a conversation that many people have had and that we've delved into for a long time now. In fact, there was a famous Joe Rogan podcast with that fucking comedian, I can't remember. But Joe was like, you would rather be murdered than raped, right? You would rather be murdered than raped. And the guy couldn't wriggle out of it because of this overriding ideology that it's a woman being raped is worse than a woman being murdered. So, like I said, with that logic, why wouldn't you murder a woman who's been raped? Because that would be better. But when you sound it out like that, it's fucking psychotic.
Yeah, I've seen both extreme ends of the illogical pathway that feminist logic and scare quotes get you to, because I've made no secret of the fact that I've been a victim of sexual assault, and it's not just been one individual or one time. And I'll be in conversations about some social issue or another and how it impacts men or how it impacts women, and when feminists can't win the argument about that particular thing with logic, reason, and facts, and they're getting their butts kicked in the debate, then they pull out, they think rape is their trump card. And, but I've seen feminists actually get hysterical on X threads. Oh, you're just harassing a rape victim, like out of nowhere. You'd be talking about taxes or some shit. And the next thing, well, I was raped. Okay. And if I'm in the thread, I'll say, okay, well, so was I. It really sucks, but it doesn't really have anything to do with this topic. And there was one feminist that tried to get me banned and like called a bunch of other people in and, went off the deep end, accusing me of being a fake victim because I wasn't, hysterical about my experience. Like my last experience with personal experience with being a sexual assault victim was before I turned to 19. And so there is absolutely, in fact, it was before I turned 18. There's absolutely no reason why I should have massive feelings about it now. I'm 53. It's been decades, literally decades, since it happened to me. And I've had plenty of time to take every bit of power away from the people who hurt me in the past by gaining the most recovery you could possibly gain from any trauma that you experience. And I've learned everything I can learn about situational awareness and the things that led to me being victimized, how to protect other people from this that are around me, and so on. Like, that's my story, and so I'm not one of those people that makes a big deal about it, because it was a big deal when it happened. But in my case, it's certainly not a big deal today. If I could make it not have happened, sure, I would make it not have happened. But if somebody offered to help me commit suicide so that I wouldn't have to feel or remember anything about it anymore, I'd be like, are you crazy? What the fuck is wrong with you? I'm a happy person now. I'm married, have 3 kids, have a grandbaby. Like, what on earth would you want to take that away from me for? And I've had that conversation with feminists where, they can't talk about anything other than, oh, you have to be traumatized for life. How can you possibly even talk to men? And they really get mad when they find out that one of my perpetrators was not male. Right? One of my perpetrators was female. And that blows their minds. They don't know how to deal with that. And then they get really mad at me. How dare you talk about that? And so it's like, well, you guys are messed up. Right? At the other end of it, people who recognize the idiocy of the feminist argument that being raped is worse than being murdered, take it to the extreme of, well, if you didn't resist because there was a gun, it wasn't really rape, you consented. And I've had to give this explanation to people, all right? If somebody takes your wallet at gunpoint, that is against the law. That is robbing you, because it is recognized that threatening your life over your money makes it a crime, right? That using force or coercion to take your property is a crime. And if somebody grabs you at gunpoint and forces you to clean their house and wash their dishes and do all of their other manual labor in the home for free, right? That is a crime, because it is using force or coercion to take away your control over what you're going to do with your body. And rape is kind of a combination of those two things. It is taking your control, robbing you of your control at gunpoint. And it does have the potential to cause other damages, like STIs and pregnancy, or if you're male, being forced to pay 18 years of child support to your rapist who has custody of a resulting baby. So it's fair for it to be a crime, and it's fair for it to be understood as traumatic. But it's also fair to point out that the most traumatic part of it isn't the sexual aspect. That is the least traumatic aspect of it. The most traumatic aspect of it is the fear, the force that is used, and the coercion that is used, the sense of being, having your agency taken away from you, right? And so that's not worse than being murdered. It sucks. Just because something's not worse than being murdered doesn't mean that it's not terrible. Feminists can't understand that. And there's a tiny handful of non-feminists or anti-feminists that also can't understand that. Right? There are varying degrees of things that suck. Some of them suck so bad that they're horrifying and leave you with nightmares and behavioral outcomes from trauma that you have to take some time to work out and overcome, so you're not fucked up for the rest of your life. Right? But that doesn't mean there aren't worse experiences that you could have. Like, for instance, thinking that your child is going to die. I had that experience for just a minute. And if someone had said, well, we can go back and take that trauma away, or we could take away the trauma of one of your rapes, I would, hands down, I would rather not know what it's like to think your baby's going to die. And like, more than anything else that's ever happened to me, that was the scariest, the hands down single most frightening moment of my life. So there you go. And the dumb thing was, it was over somebody's wording. It didn't actually, there was no real threat to his life. There was a threat to my life. but I didn't know that. In any case, so there you go. Feminist logic isn't logic. Bucking feminist logic by going too far in the other direction isn't logic either. And the reality is that true logic is not even in between. It's off to the side of both of those. And speaking of feminist logic, women are victims of being told that they cannot, the intersectional feminists cannot have their long march through the institutions. And the first three things, the first three things on this list are undeniably long march through the institutions. We have removed all consider of race, gender, or ethnicity of Air Force Academy applicants. So in other words, whether you get in, it doesn't make a difference whether you get in or not. If you are black, white, male, female, tall, short, fat, skinny, well, maybe fat, I don't know. That might make a difference. But yeah, none of the things that are affirmative action things, DEI things, make a difference in whether you get in and what advice they give you on your direction, your study. It's really, really not necessary. None of that's necessary. And so they're mad about that executive order. They're mad that Harvard University has been told no DEI. They're mad that two female military leaders were fired. Right? They don't even say why they were fired. They're just mad that they were fired. The commander-in-chief has the right to do that, by the way. Men get fired all the time. Oh, yes, the link is in the low bar to this list. Men get fired all the time. Feminists never say anything about, oh, it's discrimination to fire that man. Nope, only if a woman gets fired, right? But then I started looking at, here we go, froze $27.5 million in Title IX grants for 16 state service providers, including 9 Planned Parenthood affiliates, reducing access to vital health care for over 800,000 Americans, most of whom are low income, right? So we know what Planned Parenthood does. They claim to provide free services for women, but then when you walk in the door, you pay a fee. That's the first thing. The second thing is they claim that abortion isn't their main deal. But if you tell them that you can either do abortions or all these other services at a particular facility, but you can't do both, they act like they have to close those facilities down. So which is it? Do you do so much abortion, so many abortions, that's your main income, and you wouldn't be able to support all of those other things if you weren't murdering babies? Or do you not need abortion to fund those? Because if that's the case, you have plenty of opportunity to just open up clinics that only do abortion and let those be funded by abortion, and take the government funding for the clinics that do pap smears and breast exams and mammograms and all that stuff, and not don't hold those patients' needs hostage to pay for your abortions. And what does Planned Parenthood do? They throw themselves on the ground, kick and scream, whine, cry, unfair. Oh, the humanity. Oh, how dare you? We can't do that. We can't separate those things. We can't run this without abortion. But we barely do any abortions, except for the fact that abortion is actually, when you count each abortion being done as the death of a human being, abortion is the leading cause of human death in the world, including the United States. And a great deal of abortion that's done around the world is exported specifically by Planned Parenthood. So don't let anybody tell you that's not their cash cow. Because if it wasn't their cash cow, if it was actually costing them money like they said, they wouldn't raise such a fuss about having to separate it from everything else they do.
But we don't define these humans as humans, so they're not humans.
And I love that argument. I always like to ask people what species they are. And fetus, by the way, is not a species. Embryo is not a species. Zygote is not a species. Gamete is not a species, and it's also not what is developing in your uterus when you're pregnant. It's also genetically distinct from the mother because it has the father's DNA. That's how you catch him when you want child support from him. Therefore, it's not part of her body. So it's technically, people like to make the personhood argument, and then they'll conflate that with the humanity argument. It is a human death. It is alive. It meets the scientific criteria for a living organism. It is human, so it is a living human organism. And therefore, when you have an abortion, you are having a living human organism killed.
A human is what we say it is. A man and a woman are what we say it is. A genocide is what we say it is. You can justify any atrocity by just saying it's not an atrocity.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing. So I start looking into this, right? This whole what's the deal with Planned Parenthood? What's their big complaint? So let's look. And it says, Trump administration is withholding, Orange Man is withholding tens of millions of dollars from Planned Parenthood clinics that provide contraception, STI testing, and other health services to low-income Americans. Notice they don't mention the biggest thing that Planned Parenthood does and the thing that the fight is over. 9 Planned Parenthood state affiliates that receive federal money from the 55-year-old Title IX family planning program got notices Monday that they shared with Politico, informing them that their funding is being temporarily withheld. The notice pointed to possible violations of federal civil rights law and President Trump's executive orders, including prohibitions on promotion of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and taxpayer subsidization, if I can pronounce things right today, of open borders. So, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why would they say that? Why would they say that at all about Planned Parenthood? Well, the letter to Planned Parenthood chapters, many of them in GOP-controlled states. Oh no. Cites the clinic's mission statements and other public documents that stress a commitment to Black communities as evidence of their non-compliance. And what is Planned Parenthood's commitment to Black communities? Well, if you look at their abortion clinics, they place them strategically in Black communities, in urban centers, in neighborhoods where the income is low and women are likely to act out of desperation. So the women of Planned Parenthood is mostly a woman-run organization. The women of Planned Parenthood are preying on the fears and desperation of women in poor communities where Black single mothers are disproportionately represented. And per capita, as a result, and part of this, because they're promoting abortion to this population specifically, Black women outnumber white women per capita 5-1 in abortions. Now, in raw numbers, they don't, because in raw numbers, white women outnumber Black women significantly. But that's still a genocide. Right? Can you imagine? This has been this way since abortion was legalized, and actually even before. Can you imagine the difference, the larger voting bloc that the black population in the United States could be with less abortion in the country, with maybe just taking that ratioed from 5 to 1 down to 1 to 1, or just eliminating it altogether. Right? The black population would have grown to become a closer population in size to the white population if Planned Parenthood had not interfered. So if we discuss disadvantaged populations that can't get out of their disadvantaged situations because they are outvoted by majority populations, say minority populations that are always outvoted. And let's say the black population is always outvoted because they are a minority population. Well, Planned Parenthood is partly to blame for that. It is directly their fault, given how many of them they have taken out before they were born, much less old enough to vote. We have a super chow from John Doe for $5. Said there's a video of on X of an IDF soldier raping a man. The IDF pig who raped the Palestinian man with a baton and caused internal damage to his intestines was celebrated, and Israelites protested to allow the IDF to rape Palestinian men. This reminds me of the 16-year-old Palestinian boy who was brutally murdered by the IDF. They poured gasoline down his throat and lit him on fire like a candle. This is one of those things that feminists gloss over as well. And this is in a lot of different foreign countries. There have been story after story of soldiers, male soldiers, that have been captured by enemy soldiers that have been treated this way. Right? And between Israel and Palestine, that kind of stuff is happening on both sides. And that's the same thing happens in the Congo. The same thing has been reported in nations in all over South America and Africa. There are occasional stories you hear about that when you dig really deep into the lore of World Wars I and II. And in Middle Eastern nations, when they're at war, this is a common thing. We always hear about it being used as a weapon against women, but it is much more frequently used as a weapon against men, and it's much more frequently used in a way that does a lot more bodily damage. It's a rabbit hole that I don't advise going down unless you have a really strong stomach for gore. But in any case, the Planned Parenthood thing. So we're not going to read this whole thing, but
It's just gotta say, it's pretty ironic that people are arguing over the concept of birthright citizenship right now in countries where people don't even have a birthright, like a right
yeah,
to birth, otherwise known as a right to life. And that really is a human right, by the way, inalienable to any country or government. It doesn't involve having a right to anyone else's labor, unless you count the woman in question going into labor. I suppose it's unhelpful that we have the same word for two different things. Labor can mean doing physical work, either as a paid employee or as a slave, or it can mean giving birth to a child that in 99% of cases you made a series of choices that led to that birth. And this is why there's so much conflation between what the working class have to go through and what women have to go through, because we call it the same thing, is labor, and this is why communism took off so much more when it comes to the mother kind of labor than it did to the slave kind of labor. Like, neither of these things are necessarily always involuntary. In fact, in the majority of cases, they are voluntary. But in the case of women, it's something they kind of have to do to keep the species going, and it's something that they invite upon themselves every time they have sex. Whereas the labor that men have to go through is very often not voluntary, any more than the sex they had was volunteering themselves to become a father. Although you could argue either way. And it's, yeah, I lost my thought process there, but you can see where I'm coming from, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I understand why labor is called labor, because it's hard. I just, mine was very difficult. That's why I thought my son was going to die, and we had to have an emergency C-section, because without the C-section, his life actually was threatened. But basically, they said this is our last chance in the middle of that C-section when they were trying to get him out. Dude found out who was in charge at the time and holed up in the rib cage, and they had to go in after him with a knife. But they thought they were going to have to make a second cut to get him out, and but they didn't. Like, I don't have 2 C-section scars or anything like that. But all turned out well in the end. But it was a lot of work. 27 hours of really being in stage uh, 4 for the majority of it, and not being able to figure out why the baby couldn't get any further, because I had an inexperienced nurse who thought he was smaller than he really was. Really not a good story. Um, I've known women who have had worse ones than me. One of my friends was in the first stage of labor for a month, and they kept telling her it was Braxton Hicks. And then she went to the hospital because she could feel that something was wrong, and it turned out that she was also way overdue, by the way. But it turned out that the umbilical cord was wrapped around her son's neck, and miracle of miracles, that actually turned out okay too. And he manages. He is the manager of a fast food restaurant now. But that was another instance where she could have lost the baby because somebody didn't know what they were doing. So, but in any case, none of that changes the fact that pregnancy, especially from the time that that spermicide and condoms became available, the first really widely available types of birth control, especially long before Gen X started hitting the age where we could get pregnant. It's voluntary from consensual sex, because you can always use, when condoms were invented, when rubber condoms specifically, vulcanized rubber condoms were invented, vulcanized rubber diaphragms were also made available. So you had both, and you can use both together. And spermicide wasn't too far off from that. And so if you use those 3 methods together, you reduce your chance of pregnancy to almost nothing. It would be enough to call it statistically impossible for you to get pregnant from sex, as a result of that. And condoms have only improved over time. Diaphragms have only improved over time. And spermicide is still widely available. And we also have other barrier methods. We have IUDs. We have the pill. We have various other forms of hormonal birth control that you don't have to think about every day today, in 2025, there is not a woman alive in the United States who has an excuse to create an unplanned pregnancy and then whine about, how did this happen to me? I don't understand. You have 11 different categories of birth control available, many of which can be combined. It is conceivable, pun intended, that you could use 4 different things together if you wanted during sex to avoid conception. And because we hold all the cards when it comes to consent, we women are the ones that, if we complain that we didn't consent, everybody from the government to all of the assistance that's available for sexual assault victims to our friends and neighbors, we get sympathy for that. Men don't, right? So we can say, oh, I'm not going to consent if you don't wear a condom. And in some countries, you say that, and he stealths, he can go to jail. All right, it's how they almost took down WikiLeaks. Like they couldn't get him on espionage or anything like that. They had some chick accuse him of rape for not using a condom during sex. But yeah. So there's no excuse, none, for women to complain that they need abortions today for convenience. But here we have this huge fight going on. And yeah, Planned Parenthood's big complaint is that they're holding their patients hostage for their ability to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and their ability to serve illegal immigrants. The letter chided the group for serving undocumented. I love how they always say undocumented. They're illegal immigrants. Writing that Planned Parenthood's funding is being withheld because the organization overtly encourages illegal aliens to receive care. So that's it. It's not that the government's actually taking money away from just wantonly, like, oh, we're just being mean to women who need pap smears and birth control pills and so on. No, they're basically saying, yeah, you can do all that. You just can't do these 2 things that you don't have to do you don't have to use any political theory at all in order to write a prescription for birth control pills. You don't have to have any ideology involved at all to give a pap smear. Right? You don't have to have any belief system that you're imposing on the people that come to you for help in order to screen somebody for genital cancers. None of that is necessary. None of the politics, none of the lying, none of the discrimination is necessary. You can provide those services completely politics free. Doctors all over the country do it in private practice that isn't federally funded. So, on to the next one. And we may get through just 2 of these today. I don't know. But okay, so that's their first thing. Now has admitted here by doing this that it is more important to them to promote these Marxist ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion, or affirmative action, or bridge is what they're calling it now, or political correctness, basically, than it is for them to serve the women who they claim rely on them. That's the first thing they've admitted. So that's the next thing they've admitted is coming up in the next one. Restricted equal opportunity for women service members by eliminating lower physical fitness standards for women in combat units. So let me repeat that. Restricted equal opportunity for women service members by eliminating lower physical fitness standards for women in combat units. So now just admitted with that women cannot compete with men. Women do not meet the same standards as men in the same numbers. That women are not equal to men. Everything a man can do isn't necessarily doable by a woman. There are things men can do that women cannot do. Or there are things men can do better than women can do them. There are things men can do faster than women can do them. And so now basically needs a leg up. Now admits that women need a leg up from government in order to be in the same workplace as men in the military. Pretty sad admission there. Now their next admission. And I'm going to skip some here to make this point. Let's see if this is... Where am I on this? Okay. Just making sure that's the right thing. Cut $12 billion in Department of Health and Human Services grants to states for programs involving infectious disease tracking, mental health services, addiction treatment, and more. Weakening already vulnerable public health resources. And that's March 26, 2025, it says. Let me see if yeah. So in the beginning of this is the article that it links to. Up here, New York Times, right? So you get halfway through the article and they admit they stole this from NBC, right? And the take that now is offering is the take that this article provides, right? But let's get rid of this because it's bullshit. So the original article from ABC, I may have to move things around here a little bit. But here we go. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is pulling back $11.4 billion in funds allocated in response to the pandemic, which they obviously mean COVID, to state and community health departments, blah, blah, blah. So this was COVID money. So what they're saying is this COVID money should have just continued indefinitely, even though the crisis is over. It would be like saying, that once FEMA establishes their activities in Texas, responding to this recent tragedy, this recent weather tragedy, that after the waters have receded and everybody that has had disaster hit their homes, has been rehomed, and the dead are buried and people's injuries are treated, and there isn't really anything for FEMA to do there anymore, that they should build a federal FEMA building there and remain and be funded because reasons. Called mission creep. They'll have to find some other work to do there, right? And in order to continue to just forever be funded by the federal government, just sitting around in Texas, disaster relieving some other thing, whatever they can come up with. Like, that's essentially the argument that is being made here with regard to these funds. So feminists admit here, first of all, that they think this is a women's issue. This is all welfare. This money is all money that is established for social services for low-income individuals. We got a super chow from Meredith G. She says, honey for the badgers, so let's try to reconcile that for the abortion legal cases. A fetus isn't human deserving of rights, but for the birthright citizenship legal cases, a fetus has rights of citizenship and should be granted class certification for a class action lawsuit. Also, the necessary health services offered by Planned Parenthood is a standard of care for a woman to obtain a prescription contraceptive, that they are not offering those services as part of an annual wellness examination. Yeah. Here's the thing with Planned Parenthood. Okay. We have this whole organization that's federally funded to provide healthcare services for women. What organization does that for men? Like, I need a cricket sound effect here for this. There isn't one. Planned Parenthood claims to offer services for men. There aren't as many clinics that do anything, that have anything available for men. And those that do not do nearly as much. They don't actually have that many men coming in for services. And if you're not on Medicaid, they're charging you money, and so it's not free. They're not doing as much for men. I suppose you could say the VA hospitals are more for men. They're the Planned Parenthood of men, right? If you get sent to war and fight for your country, then you can get your medical services paid for, right? But aside from that, according to the federal government, if you're a man in this country, you can just fucking die. Like, unless you have children, they don't care. Right? They don't fund anything for you. And they sure as shit aren't going to fund anything to prevent you from having children, because then you're not useful. So yeah, with this one, they're admitting that women are financially dependent on the federal government. And what that means is that women are financially dependent on men. So I looked up what percentage of U.S. tax dollars are paid by male taxpayers. And of course, the AI overview sort of tried to be politically correct about this. Well, there's no way to figure that out, right? But then it gives this, however, some studies provide insights into the general trend. And this is the one I think is the single most important right here. A study found that unmarried male filers had an average tax liability of $5,221 compared to $2,639 for unmarried female filers. So given equal status, unmarried and filing a tax return, so no one person being head of the household and the other person isn't affecting it. It's both are considered. If there is a household, they would be considered head of the household. If they have children, they're head of the household, right? And men's tax liability is double that of women, right? And of course, among men and women in general, you have it drops down here. It's generally understood that men having higher average incomes and potentially different filing statuses and deductions tend to contribute a larger portion of income taxes compared to women. So what feminists are saying is they want that big chunk of men's taxes, mostly men's taxes. Men are paying double that of women, and then women get all these benefits. They get welfare benefits if they are unwed or low-income mothers. There's food stamps, there's rental assistance, or other forms of housing assistance. The Department of Health and Human Services can even help you pay for a car. For a long time, there was child care assistance. I don't know if that's still a thing, but I believe it was called Title 20. And at one point, I looked into being a provider, and when I started looking into the experiences of other providers, I decided that wasn't going to be a thing for me. We'll just say that if you do it in your home, you need to lice spray your carpets every day. It's bad. But in any case, yeah, they just want men to be taxed to pay for women's choices. Right? When you look at my X account and you go to my main page that has my history and not whatever just shows up in your feed. You see, the little picture that I have and everything with the blue hair girl with the red pill. And behind it is my banner. And instead of a nice picture and everything up there, I just have a black screen with white text that says in all capital letters, "Stop paying women to make stupid choices." And the reason is because it's fucking expensive. And it's not just expensive in one way. So here we have, the majority of taxes are paid by men. The majority of taxes are paid by men. It's demonstrable through studies on who's paying what. Women are more likely to qualify for benefits, so they're not paying as much taxes because of that. Earned income tax credit, child tax credit. So they're less liable partly because of that. And then after not getting taxed as much because they have children, then they also are more likely to be eligible for all of those social safety nets, Medicaid, CHIP. I don't know if CHIP is still considered a thing, but there's Medicaid for children. There's Medicaid for parents with dependent children who are under a certain income level, and most of those parents are single moms. So then you have on top of that, like if you add the effects of raising a child in a family without an involved father, children of involved fathers are more likely to grow up to become unwed parents. They're 50% more likely to grow up to become unwed parents, and they are 50% more likely to end up on welfare. If they're boys, they're 50% more likely than children raised with involved fathers to grow up and get into trouble with the law. So, in addition to taking men's tax dollars and spending them, not paying taxes themselves, they're also the cause of future tax liabilities in the next generation in multiple ways. Stop paying women to make stupid choices. It's fucking expensive. Then the next one that I was going to look at here, I'm going to skip several. We'll maybe come back to those later, but there it is. All right. And this one kind of hit me too as I was going through, and I wanted to talk about it today, even though it's on a different page. So we have reduced accessibility to Social Security benefit applications. For those outside of the United States, Social Security is our pensioner system, our state-run, government-run pensioner system. Like you can contribute to your own pension, and your employer can contribute to a pension. I have a pension fund with my employer. If you work for, years and years for the same company, like a lot of people will have a teaching career where they work for 30 years. When they retire, they have contributed to a fund that then pays them a retirement income, right? But the Social Security system was created for people who do not have that. And it's now being used for everybody's eligible to receive Social Security income. But if you've got retirement income, you can get taxed on it. I shouldn't say everybody, because if you're a school teacher, you're not. If you retire from school teaching, it's not. There's different legal stipulations. You're not necessarily eligible for both because it's also a state-run retirement system. But you still have to pay into it. So the government does double dipping, but they don't want you to double dip back. But in any case, they're mad here, right? Because the Trump administration apparently reduced accessibility to Social Security benefit applications and changes by requiring in-person or online identity verification. So in other words, they're upset that the Trump administration made it more difficult to defraud the Social Security system. Now, why would they be upset about that? Oh, yeah, that's right. They're protecting illegal immigrants and stuff. Eliminating phone verification options. Well, it's a lot more difficult to verify by phone. You can provide actual ID on online or in person, but in a phone call, you're not showing somebody like your driver's license, your state ID, your birth certificate, your social security card, none of that. You're having a conversation, right? You might hand over a number and tell somebody a number, but you're not proving that that's yours. You don't even have to prove you have it in your possession. The majority of adult social security beneficiaries are women. So I looked into this, right? Because they have a link here. Women's stake in Social Security. Women are the majority of adult beneficiaries collecting Social Security as retired or disabled workers and as wives and widows. So it's not just one thing, right? When a guy passes away, there's a widow's benefit. There's a benefit for his children. If she hasn't worked, she may not be eligible for her own Social Security, but she can get that widow's benefit. It won't be as much, but it's still money the government pays to her based on his pay-in. But retired or disabled workers is a different story. All right, and then there's also you can, if you get on disability when you're underage, you get full disability. But if you reach adulthood, you have to work a certain number of years before you can get full disability. So there's another program called SSI, Supplemental Security Income, I think it's called, which is much smaller than Social Security. But if you are deemed disabled and you didn't pay into Social Security, you can still get that. Which probably the majority of that is also women, because it's more likely for somebody to reach adulthood, not work, but not get deemed disabled, and then, so many years later, start collecting disability money. It says women make up 56% of Social Security beneficiaries age 62 or older, 66% age 85 or older. Women spend fewer years in the workforce. This is, this is familiar right here. Women spend fewer years in the workforce, right? And they typically earn less than men when they are in the workforce, which means they are less likely to qualify for a private pension. And if they do, it will be smaller than the pension earned by men. So, when feminists talk about the wage gap and they say for the same work, then they admit women spend fewer years in the workforce. Well, that's not the same work. So feminists here with the Social Security income, what they've admitted there is that women rely on men to work themselves to death so that they can have retirement income, even though they didn't work as hard or as long. They didn't do equal work in the workplace. They didn't pay in as much. And and they're going to outlive their husbands. Richard Bier gave us $5 and said, well, technically piloting an armed drone from a shipping container-sized control room could be considered a combat role. The physical requirements likely don't have to be as intense, and something that a woman could do while pregnant, hence the maternity flight suits. Just don't ask her to parallel park the drone when returning from the mission. Oh, that's great. Reality, though, when you put a woman in one of those positions, that means that it's not open to a man. Right? So if you create a circumstance where women don't have to meet the same standards, and they don't have to be part of the same whatever style system, if it's lottery, if it's performance, or whatever, that determines it, that sends men into combat zones to actually face bombs and guns and mines, landmines, IEDs, not to be confused with IUDs because that would hurt really bad. Basically, you're creating a situation where if a man is eligible, he's forced to do that because the women get all the cushy jobs because they couldn't meet the physical standards because they are not equal to the men. And remember, been a month or two, but we went through and examined some of the requirements involved, some of the things that the military has been having to do in order to adjust the military environment to accommodate women. And it was pretty obvious by the time we were done. It is not cost effective to have women in the military at all. It's a sad thing. There may be other support jobs that women could do that are not, that are not military jobs that you could draft women into that are civilian jobs, but the expenses related to accommodating women in the military, you don't have to accommodate men in the military. They just mold men into what they want men to be and impose upon men what they want men to do, right? But they have to accommodate women in the military because women are not equal to men. Women are not physically equal to men, and women are not psychologically equal to men. Wow, Chris, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. If it's analog. Yeah, there is no draft. No, there is no draft is a bullshit argument. I will give you this though. Right now, they haven't gone into the second stage of the draft where they actually start calling people up and saying, "Come in." We're only in the first stage where they make you register. Well, they don't make you register because you're a chick, right? They didn't make me register because I'm a chick. They made my brother register. They made my husband register. They made my son register. Right? They made my father register during the Vietnam War. You're right. Broken or stopped. Doesn't matter, actually. Obviously, you're young enough that you've never had a VCR. That clock's not broken. It's just not set because why bother? In any case, the first stage of the draft is selective service. And selective service basically imposes upon every man. There are men that I take care of in the work that I do who not only cannot hold a job, they can't even hold a spoon, okay? There's some of them that can't even hold a spoon, can't stand up by themselves, or can't stand up. Guess who had to register for the draft when they turned 18? Those guys had to register for the draft. But I, an able-bodied woman, did not. Now, I'm all for arguments to end selective service and eliminate the possibility of any future move to the second stage where they start calling men up and forcing them to go into training to prepare them to go to war. But the idea that it should be imposed on men and nothing should be imposed on women, just bullshit. Albatross gave us $5. No statement came through. Thank you very much for that, Albatross. If you had intended to send a super chow through, you'll have to let us know. Like a statement through, you'll have to let us know. It's possible that the system ate it, but in any case, yeah, that's. Thank you very much for that anyway. And but on to go back where I was here. And I think I'm going to make this the last thing because there's a nice divider here. So this one was interesting too. Cut $12 billion in Department of Health and Human Services grants to states for programs involving. Oh wait, I already read that one, didn't I? Okay, so the next one then, the Department of Education. Instructed the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return authority over education to the states and their local communities. And they claimed defied the Constitution by dismantling federal oversight of education. Right. So, defied the Constitution, did they? Do I have it open? I looked this up. There is nothing in the Constitution that actually mandates a Department of Education. Like it's not a thing. Like, there's no bill of, or nothing in the Bill of Rights that says the federal government has to oversee public education. There's nothing in the original Constitution. There's nothing in any amendment after that explicitly states that the federal government must have a Department of Education. So that's just female hysteria. But why would they want it federalized? Well, go back to Title IX. All right, Title IX was created in 1972, and initially, it was a law that existed specifically to address a system of quotas that existed in universities, reserving seats in certain professional areas for male students who were going to go on and take jobs or start their own businesses in those areas. Physicians, attorneys, areas like that. And back in the day, there were two factors that kind of affected universities' decision to do that. One was women did have more of a tendency than men to study for a degree, get that degree, and then not use it to earn a living, not provide any prestige from the university as a graduate from that university working in that field of study, and not make donations to the university because they weren't making any money. So they didn't have like some debt to the university. They didn't, of gratitude, and they might even not pay off their college loans. Chris, you're almost right, but not quite. Trump won because men outvoted women. And I hope they outvote women again in the next election. But in any case, so back then, women started doing more in those areas. Women started looking for more prestige themselves in those roles. And so it became more logical for universities to allow more women into those areas of study. But the universities weren't keeping up. They had started to keep up. The trend of having quota systems like that was dying. Feminists didn't think it was dying fast enough, so they got this law passed. And so by the time it went into effect, it was pretty much outdated. So then there's this agency to enforce this new law, and they have very little to do, and they're rapidly becoming unnecessary. Well, when you build onto the government, just like with the welfare stuff, that it turns out that that was COVID funding that was being rolled back because the COVID crisis is over, and not permanent funding. And there's two instances of that on this list, by the way. When you create a law that requires some agency or department to enforce it, you must have, or board, you must have work for that new government body to do indefinitely. So as soon as that happened, they started in on sports, right? And in order to create work for the overseers of the application of Title IX, they started attacking men's Olympic sports. The justification, scare quotes, was there wasn't parity of participation at universities in extracurricular athletic activities. In other words, universities had bigger sports programs for men than they did for women. And feminists assumed that this was because the women were being discriminated against. Right? What they ended up proving was the women were less frequently interested. There were not as many women at the universities that were interested in athletic participation as there were men who were interested in athletic participation. Well, what the Board of Education's agency, what the not Board of Education, the Education Department's board that oversees Title IX did, was they created a quota system that required parity. So, in other words, if you have half of your male students involved in some athletic activity, you got to have half of your female students involved in some athletic activity. And if you try to prove that you don't have a level of equal interest, then you lose the argument. You're not allowed to have fewer women playing sports at your school. So what ended up happening? Dozens of lawsuits, dozens of threats to colleges for lawsuits and so on, because of this lack of parity. And universities all over the country during the late 80s and early 90s, clear into the late 90s, started having to, because they could not get more women involved in sports. They couldn't get the women to, like, they couldn't persuade them to do, like, powder puff football or tackle football or any of the types of sports that men were involved in that women weren't doing. So instead, they shut down the men's sports teams that were not as profitable as their football and basketball programs were, which is usually the most profitable, or their baseball programs, most profitable programs for the universities. Right. So there was a great loss of university level Olympic wrestling and university level Olympic gymnastics for men. They would still have their women's gymnastics team, but they would eliminate the men's, right? And for years, like, men who might get scholarships for participation in those sports, or men who might be Olympic hopefuls, couldn't participate at the university level, not because women were being discriminated against, but because women were not interested enough in participation to equal the interest that men had in those schools. Right. So that's where it went. Right. So then when they got to the point where they didn't have any schools left to badger and threaten, browbeat about participation, they came out with the Clary Act, which required universities to start tracking and reporting on sexual misconduct on campus. And they used as the excuse the laws on sexual harassment in the workplace, where they consider the academic environment to be a similar environment to the workplace, and they treated Title IX as a means of imposing the same standards and the same, um, not necessarily law, but policy on university campuses that get imposed on workplaces. And it's a complicated thing in workplaces too, because, for instance, if you work at a location where there is heavy labor being done, right? Even just occasional heavy labor, like carrying something heavy into a store from a shed outside or a storage area outside, right? And the manager imposes on the men on your staff that they have to go out and get those things, but the women don't. And one of the guys complains about the unequal treatment. That's considered harassment of the women in the workplace. Why doesn't she have to do everything I have to do? Well, how dare you harass this woman by suggesting equal standards be imposed on her in the name of equality? Right? University campuses started policing dating relationships. Right? University can't, not the police, right? They created something akin to a human resources department for students. They started policing conflict between students that didn't involve sexual misconduct, but could be called sexual misconduct. So, couple dates for 6 months, they break up, and they're taking the same classes, and the guy doesn't stop showing up to class. The girl can now accuse him of stalking her, and he has to go through an investigation. And even if the only time she ever sees him anywhere is that he hasn't stopped attending classes that they scheduled together, and hasn't dropped out, basically, that's considered harassing her. I had had a young man contact me. What do I do about this? And my main advice, by the way, to any young man dealing with anything like this on a university campus: tell your parents what's going on and get a lawyer, because you have equal rights under the Constitution, and you cannot get through this without a lawyer. It is imperative. Start documenting everything and get a lawyer. And if you can help it, avoid being alone. Bring your buddies with you when you go places. And don't have anything to do with the girl, and don't lack witnesses, credible witnesses. But this is happening all over the country. There are currently over 800 due process lawsuits in the United States as a result of what happened next. After the Clary Act, you had in 2011 the Dear Colleague letter that obligated universities to not just police and investigate and report to the Department of Education, but then to also impose penalties. So they now had to have these tribunals that were like university court, where they would have a trial with the accused student being the defendant and the accuser being like a plaintiff, represented by the school against the other student, and railroad the accused, so that they were actively getting rid of men accused of any kind of sexual misconduct. And the treatment didn't go both ways. and the standards were not the same as the legal standards in criminal court for those same offenses. They didn't even have to be as high as the university's own standards for other equal or worse offenses. So that same student, right, that's accused of stalking for continuing to go to his scheduled classes after his girlfriend breaks up with him, might be kicked out of school and blacklisted from other schools. Whereas if he had beaten the shit out of another student, he would have had more due process in his hearing and had a better chance at remaining on campus. You know, like, oh, you stole my French fries, I'm gonna kick your ass. Like, that would have been more tolerated than simply attending his scheduled classes because a woman didn't want him there. So there you go. Now we have this situation where millions of dollars are being spent by schools defending against these lawsuits. And hundreds of young men have gone into debt for an education that they don't get to finish because the university campus was able to deny them the service that they provided or that they paid for without due process. And then on top of that, if you have it the other way around, if the individual is guilty but female, the guy still can get in trouble. Reason Magazine actually reported on a case at Amherst where a young man was passed out drunk, was completely unaware of his surroundings, had no memory of the incident. His girlfriend's friend was in his dorm room and she sexually assaulted him. And then she texted to her other friends about it, feeling worried because it was pretty clear that she was the aggressor and so on. And then nothing came of it for several months. And then a group of girls that she was friends with convinced her to report him for sexual misconduct. And they kicked him out of school and he had to sue. So even when the woman was the aggressor, even when the woman engaged in sexual misconduct, the school blamed the victim because he was male. Now, if you want an alternative, what should happen if there's a rape on a university campus? The answer is really simple. The same thing that should happen if there's a rape on public transport or in the home or in a dark alley downtown in a community, and neither of the people involved is a university student. Exactly the same thing should happen, whether it's on a university campus or not, whether the people are university students or not. The victim should go to the hospital and ask the hospital to call the police. You call 911 if you can't get out of the situation. You don't go to some human resources department to deal with a violent crime. Because if you go to the human resources department of your university and you let them be the ones to deal with a violent crime, let's say in case number 5, right, the guy was actually guilty, went into the girl's dorm room, found her passed out drunk in her bed and raped her. All right. You go to the university tribunal, they find him responsible, they kick him out of school and blacklist him. Okay. And then what? Where does he go? What does he do? The answer, I can tell you what the answer is not, right? It's not jail. He doesn't go into a sex offender program. He doesn't get any of the type of therapy that they give to sex offenders. Nobody addresses the causes behind his behavior, the mental causes behind his behavior. He just moves on. But now he's angry. because he's been kicked out of school. And the less than 6% of the population that commit rape are entitled. They are violent. Outside of that situation, they engage in other criminal behavior. Right? So you have just, by bypassing the actual legal system, released an angry, fucked up person who commits criminal violence back out into the community to go hurt somebody else. What the hell kind of bullshit idea was that? So the last admission that the National Organization for Women has engaged in here is that they need the beatings to continue for morale to improve. You must not solve any problems. You must maintain systems that do not work. You must give feminists control over educational environments and impose regulations on educational environments that bypass the legal system and reduce the punishment, and therefore the ability to address the behavioral causes of both men and women who engage in sexual misconduct, in illegal sexual misconduct. You also create punishments for sexual misconduct that's not necessarily illegal in those circumstances. So you basically give feminists the right to take away somebody's equal access to education on the basis of somebody else's feelings without proof. Feminists have admitted they need to mooch off of men. They have admitted men and women are not equal. And women, there are many things men can do that women can't. And women are not as strong. Women are not as tough. Women cannot meet the same physical standards. They've admitted that they're willing to hold their female patients' healthcare hostage in order to promote ideologies that have nothing to do with that healthcare. And they have admitted that they're more hell-bent on promoting ideology than solving some of the biggest problems. Like, remember at the start of the show, we were talking about rape is feminist trump card. When they can't win an argument about something else, that's what they bring up, right? It is the most important issue for women that, affects, depending on what research you read, anything from 1 in 5 to 1 in 3. And therefore, it's a crisis. But God forbid you do anything useful about it. How dare you think that might be a good idea? And that's feminism in a nutshell. That's the National Organization for Women. They have basically admitted they are retarded. With that, I think we've pretty much covered what I wanted to cover today. I don't really think they are. I think they're actually malicious, But with that, I think I will thank Mike for being here. I know you didn't get to say much, Mike.
I didn't think of much to say. I turn up on Tuesdays and Thursdays to make sure that Hannah and Brian never have to do a show by themselves. But they can. I know they can. If no one turned up, Hannah could breeze through this in 2 hours. Like,
I
easily.
probably could.
You'll both have this ability that's frankly miraculous to us introverts, that you can just talk for 2 hours and you never have to struggle to think of something to say. God bless you. God bless you all.
You're a sweetheart. The thing is, I do love when you go on a rant, though. I absolutely do. I'm surprised you didn't about the taxes, because I know that the systems in your country are pretty much the same. There's different names and some different wordings of policies and shit. Richard Beer says we have an incoming super chat. It hasn't showed up yet. But Yeah, so I was surprised because you're one of the men who pays into that higher percentage of taxes. You're single and childless, and technically you pay more taxes on your income if your tax system is run like the tax system is in the United States. Um, if you were a married father, your income would be taxed at a slightly lower rate because you would be the head of a household. That you would have dependents, but because you are a single, not a father and a single man, you end up paying more. Lauren's in the same situation. Um, she doesn't have children, and she is not married. So if you're single and living alone, you are not considered the head of a household. You don't have a household of one. So you're taxed at no dependents, no earned income tax credit. I don't think. At least I don't think. Like my husband and I haven't been eligible for that for years. Um, no no deductions for the things that families get, and so you pay more per dollar at the same income level that an individual who is part of a family would pay. Um, we did get a Rumble rant from NobaFan21 who gave us $1 and said the worst argument I've ever heard when telling a woman that men are legally required to sign up for the draft was women always wanted to join the military and refused to allow me to counter her. Women didn't always want to join the military, and in fact, anti-suffragettes who outnumbered suffragettes significantly when the suffragette movement started in the United States. One of their main arguments was that they did not want the draft imposed on women, and they feared that if women got the right to vote, that would follow. So they feared being in the military. And even today, right now, any woman who is within the age range that you could be qualified to join the military can walk into a recruiter's office right now and sign up. Any woman can do that. Nothing is stopping you. There's no discriminatory law, policy, nothing that says you can't sign up. But it's like something like 17% now of the military is women. Right? So fewer than 1 in 5 soldiers are women. And then when you get into the more dangerous the role the soldier is in, the fewer women are in that part of the military. So yeah, if women always wanted to join the military, then why isn't it 50-50? Why aren't women clamoring to be today included in the draft? Right? Why when they have the women's march, why is it that they have a whole page full of women's issues that include things that are really not women's issues, like the environment, unless you count the fact that a lot of environmental damage is caused by women's beauty habits and women's birth control. But they didn't make including women in the draft one of their issues. They didn't march for that. There's not been a single women's march type protest for that. They've protested vehemently for the right to kill their babies. They protested vehemently for sole control over elections in the United States. But no protest for more women in the military for some reason. Even though nothing is stopping them. Oh, yeah. John Doe has a good point, too. All the SSRIs they take. More women by far are on SSRIs than men in the United States. And, more women are contributing to the amount of drugs, these types of drugs that are filtering into our water system. So, yeah. That super chow, it is not coming through, and it's getting late. I'm gonna double check and see if Brian can see it. Yeah, it's just not. It's not coming through at my end. So, like, it's not showing up in the Discord where it, and I don't have access to the back room. Well, I mean, we read out the one about piloting an armed drone. Was that the one that you were talking about, Richard Beer? Because if it's not, I don't know if it got lost in the system, got held up in the system, or whatever. But oh, there it is. It just came through. So Richard Beer sent us $5 and said, I heard a story where a man was accused by a woman and kicked out of his university, transferred to another university, and the accusers notified the new school, and he was expelled from there too. He then enrolled in a community college, and the accusers notified the community college, and he was again expelled. He landed some kind of unpaid internship, and the accusers notified the employer, which cost him the internship position. And there was a fifth instance, and I think that he did file a lawsuit against the accuser. Well, I hope he did, because that is actually stalking and harassment. And if a woman does it in the court system, it's considered vexatious litigation. But when they're doing it just in the public, like that, then it becomes, a different story. They can't be legally stopped by the court system. A vexatious litigant, when you find someone guilty as a vexatious litigant, the judgment against them includes they can't engage in any more litigation against the person that they were targeting. And if their litigation had been had involved or included things like filing false complaints with police and stuff, the police can't even take their complaints against that person without a judge's order saying they can make the complaint. So if they want to accuse him of anything else, they have to actually go to a judge and get permission. And the case that got me started making contact with the men's rights movement was a case like that. 7 years long of this vexatious litigant filing for frivolous restraining orders, and then making false allegations, and then the allegation would be demonstrably proved false with physical evidence, and then that would all get dropped, and she would file for a new emergency restraining order and start all over again. And the accusations ranged from accusing him of rape, and each time that she changed her story on that, she changed it to another time when he had physical evidence proving that he was in a different location than she claimed, involved in something there were other people around him, and the allegation couldn't possibly be true. She filed for a restraining order, and then like a couple of weeks later accused him of a drive-by greeting that never happened. So eventually the court deemed her to be a vexatious litigant, and she cannot file complaints against him anymore. She can't get a restraining order against him. She can't file any kind of court motions or anything like that. Richard, the throwing lawnmower case was another case, and that one lasted 20 years. But I don't have as much documentation for that case. I wasn't right there when it was happening. It happened to a childhood friend of mine who really he has a rough time selecting women who are not psycho bitches. But in any case, yeah. What Richard Beer described in his Super Chow, that's essentially the same thing as vexatious litigation, but with universities. So now that we've read the Super Chow, thanks everybody for listening. Thanks, Mike, for being part of the panel, and thanks for Brian for doing all the work that you do in the background to make this happen, and everybody else who works in the background to make HBR Talk happen. Good night, all.
Men's rights activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. holy shit, you're fucked.